Welcome back everyone. This is video 2 in the series developing our Angular 13 and .NET Backend project. In this video I really just wanted to talk about what are all these files that we generated in the first video. We typed in 2 commands and all of a sudden we had, 100 files that were ready to be checked into source control. So we're just going to go through and figure out what some of those files are, what are some of the important ones that you need to know about, and maybe just help you understand the whole pipeline of things that are happening here. So let's switch over to Visual Studio Code. I've got the project open that we made in the last video, and I'll just continue working on the same project for the rest of the series here. Let's start with the server side of things, so the things outside of the client app folder. Obviously, we kind of demoed that there was an API set up. So we've got this weather forecast controller. If we open that up, the important parts that you need to know is just that it's been decorated with the API controller. It's got a route set up that's just called controller, and I'll explain that in just a moment. And the name of it is going to be important because we're not putting a route name in and we're just putting controller. So it's going to know that this is the weather forecast API when it's called. The rest of it's just sample stuff. Here we've got the logger being injected in, and this is dependency injection. That's where this logger is coming from. And we'll be going a lot more in depth into the .NET dependency injection as well as the Angular dependency injection, because those are 2 separate things, but they work fairly close. It's almost the same. And here we've got the actual API method that gets called by the Angular website. It's not been labeled with a name, it's just called get. This is trying to show you those kind of best practices for RESTful APIs. I actually won't be following this standard too much in the series. I like to have names on all of my APIs. It's just the way I do it. If you're building maybe a public API that people are going to be calling, you might want to stick to the standard where get, is just going to get that expected result based off the controller name, and you're using HTTP post properly and everything else like that. So just know that I will deviate from that kind of standard a little bit, and it's just a preference. I've done this plenty of times, and I find that following that standard is a little tedious. It just doesn't make as much sense in the end for most of the APIs that I'm writing for non-public facing APIs. Keep that in mind though, if you need to do a little research on that. If you want to follow it or not. To me, it's just about, this is I'm going to do things the functional way that work best for me, and I think will probably work best for you. But there are some scenarios where following the standard is, definitely a safe bet, especially if you're going to have other people connecting to these APIs. We've got pages. Nothing important that we need to go into on that for now. We've got the properties. We opened this really quick in the first video just to get our port number. Now for the most part, this is Visual Studio. Maybe Writer uses it too, I can't recall. But it is being used slightly in VS Code. You could delete it, but then you'd start getting different port numbers than the ones that we already set up. So I would just say leave it for now, and just know that this is being used in addition to our VS Code launch.json. You can see actually, and we'll just go ahead and demonstrate that since we're talking about what all of this stuff does. There's some environment variables here. If you're not familiar with those, we'll go into those a little bit, probably in this video. But one of the important ones to note is this ASP.NET Core hosting startup assemblies. Now this Microsoft.ASP.A Core.SPA proxy it's doing a lot of things when we start this website up, including linking our Angular and .NET side of things up. This is what's actually launching that terminal window. This is doing that placeholder website where it says the proxy is being loaded. There's a lot of things being hit here, and it's a lot of people don't know why that stuff is happening, because what I guess what we can go on next is the program.cs. Now this is the entry point for the websites from the program, and it may look slightly odd because it's using a brand new formatting that doesn't for the entry points that doesn't kind of match up to the whole namespace and class thing that you're expecting to see, but just kind of go with the flow for now. And in here is normally where you'd see the old SPA proxy stuff, or if you've done these projects before, or they just don't see, hey, this is the entry point for my program. I'm not doing anything with this SPA stuff. How is that working? Well, just know that because of this environment variable let me click on the right file for you. It's because of this startup assembly here. This is actually, it has a lot of code inside of it that's being called and set up. So that's what's taking care of all that. You don't have access to the source for it directly here, but I think this project, like a lot of the other ones, is probably open source and on GitHub now. So if you're interested in knowing how it's doing what it's doing, just go ahead and search for this project on GitHub. And without even looking, I'm just going to go ahead and say that you'll probably find it there. Again, this middle section is the one that we're actually using through calling things through the VS Code. I don't know specifically how it knows to use this one or what's happening there. Probably, some default convention kind of thing that's working, but I can't explain that. What I can tell you though is if we were to remove this line, I cut it so I can keep it on my clipboard, and we cut that out and we hit start. I don't know if you'll actually get to see what I'm seeing here, but my browser is actually, it's not able to connect to the website. My terminal window didn't open with the Angular saying, things were compiled successfully. None of that happened. And it didn't happen because something in this code here that I couldn't explain is looking for an environment variable with the startup assemblies. And I guess it's hitting this, this DLL file's program.cs equivalent. So it's entry point, and it's doing some additional things. Just to demonstrate again that both of these files are being used together, the launch.json and the launch settings.json, you can see that we can actually put that over here into the environment variable section of our launch.json. And I prefer to move it in here, and I leave that development one there most of the time. I think this one actually does the overriding though. And we're going to have that environment variable set in here now. And if you were to start and stop it, which I'll do, I'm waiting for my browser to load. And you can see that now we've actually got the terminal window opening. It's got the SPA launching proxy temporary page. And I'll just go ahead and let it finish since we're here. And perfect, everything works again. So stop debugging, and just know you can put your environment variables here in the launch.json. And unless you have people on your team that are, maybe they're working with Visual Studio, one guy loves Rider, the other guy likes VS Code, I would recommend putting it in this launch.json. But if you have a mixed team, it might suit you guys better to just keep it in here and just make sure that everybody's getting the same, the same launching that they expect. Okay, what else do we have? That was the properties launch.json. The app settings, we can talk about those a little bit. You can see here we've got the app settings.development.json, and we have the app settings.json. Now, since we were just talking about environment variables, this ASP.NET Core environment is being set to development. And that just happens to tie to the name that's in between this app settings.json. So what's happening here is in the startup code, it's actually building its configuration and reading. It's going to be able to read these configurations based off the development environment. So if we had a different development environment, maybe you have one called, we'll just say testing or, staging, maybe. You'd come in here, you'd add another file. I just did a copy and paste, Control C, Control V, and we'll do a rename. And you can click it, right click and rename, or you can hit F2, and we'll just call this file appsettings.staging.json. And if we load it up now that our environment is set to staging, it would read from this file first if it existed, and depending on what property it's trying to get, if it exists in this file. If we didn't want to override the logging settings in the staging environment, we just don't need to include those settings in our staging one. And what it's going to do is say, okay, try to read it from the appsettings.staging.json. I don't see that key here, or I don't even see that settings file here. It's going to fall back to the appsettings.json file. And then luckily here, it is going to find the logging levels that we've set for this project. And that kind of ties in with the environment variables. And before we move on, let's just go ahead and explain these logging levels and what they do and how you can utilize them to kind of filter out messages. And when I say filter out messages, I'm talking about these blue messages down here in the console. So if you look here, we have an info message, and it's being logged from the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.SPA middleware. And again, it's an info message, which is informational, or information up here. So if we were to set this default logging level to something higher than information, such as warning, from then on, when we ran our program and it hit these lines of code that we're trying to do logging, if it was higher than information, which warning is, it would not list these messages below it anymore. So it would go ahead and skip logging these to the console output. And maybe you didn't want to change it for the whole entire project. Maybe you want to leave this at information, but maybe from now on, all the messages, well, in this case, all the messages from Microsoft are set to warning, except for you can see that it's even got this one identified, but it also matches Microsoft. It's just a different namespace that's further inside of it. So if this line of code wasn't here, they would fall back to the Microsoft one, just like the one we just looked at, which starts with Microsoft dot, because that's the namespace. It would fall back to that warning sign. But if it finds something that's specified specifically or further in the chain of this, so even though this one is the SPA middleware one, if we came up in here and we added it to do information, which is kind of redundant with the default level, but let's just say we wanted to change that to not show anymore for that specific, all of the messages that might come from this SPA proxy middleware, we can set that to warning. And on that same note, if we were to say everything that's in the ASP.NET Core SPA proxy namespace, which this middleware one is a part of, it's just kind of, looking down the list and saying, okay, you're a part of me, then this SPA middleware one would also now be set to warning. So those are the log levels, how they're used. And this doesn't just apply to libraries that are outside of yours that have been implemented by other people. We'll go ahead and demonstrate some local logging as well. So our namespace is the name of the project that we picked. So in this case, it's just called website. So maybe we want to log even debug messaging for these. Now, the reason we would go ahead and specify it is because debug is lower than the default information one. And so all of the debug messages are going to be excluded throughout all of the different libraries that we implement from that other people have written, as well as our own code. So our project, again, the namespace is website because that's the project name that we hit, that we typed in. And I'll just go ahead and open up one of these files to show you that the namespace that weather forecast is in is the namespace website. So if you're not sure what yours is, just go ahead and open up one of these .cs files. And again, the first block in this namespace here for us is website. So that's what you're going to want to type in if you want to modify it for everything inside of your website. So we'll leave it at website. We'll change the debug level. Actually, we'll comment this one out for now. And what we'll do is we'll make a change to the weather forecast controller since it already has a logger setup that's being injected. And anytime the API is called, we'll go ahead and log a message. So we'll do a log debug, and we'll just go ahead and put a message that somebody called the API. Okay, nothing fancy. And if we launch our project, I'll just go ahead and show you that the debug message comes out. Okay. Just waiting for my browser to show up for you guys. There we go. And if we go ahead and go to the page that did the fetch data, which is going to call the API, again, our debug console right now is set on the client one. We're going to switch down here to the .NET one. And if we look, we don't see our message anywhere in here. So we'll go back to the app settings. Oh, I was blind for a moment. And now we'll go ahead and add that line back in that I had removed. So we'll say everything under the website namespace, I want to log debug or higher. And we'll just fix our format. Save that. And when you make changes again to the .NET side of things, it's not hot reloading, so you're going to want to stop debugging if it's still running and start a new session. And once my browser comes up, I'm just going to go ahead and go to the same fetch data page, and we'll check for the logging. So there you go, we've got the Hello World website up. We'll fetch the data, which called the API. And if we go into our logging for the website, you'll see now that there's a debug message in here, and it says something called the API. So perfect. Now if you look, this namespace is under the controllers.weather forecast controller. So if we just wanted to change the debugging just in this API, because we don't want to enable it for everything, what we would do is we would have wrote it. Maybe we left, we only want to show warning messages for our website, but if it comes from the weather forecast controller, we want to see debug messages or higher. So this logging is pretty important to have set up the way that you want it. You don't want to be going into your project and commenting out messages because maybe you have too many debug messages and you just want to find that information message. You don't want to be removing those debug lines and commenting them out and forgetting to put them back. You want to be coming into this app settings or the specific one that you're working on. Like I said, we had made a staging. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. We don't plan on using it. And because, again, we had changed our settings to take us into an environment for staging, we're going to set that to development as well, as it should be, because there's going to be some code that we'll go through that actually gets called because this is set as development. So back to the app settings. Like I said, in this case, I'm going to put these files side by side so we can see them. I've got the app settings on the right and I've got the development ones on the left. Now they've both got a logging section. They've both got the log level section under that, but they've both got keys in here that say default information. Now, if I change the root app settings one and I put it to warning, that's not going to do anything for us because this key exists on the other side and it's going to use the one that matches our development environment. But maybe you have a key on the development side that's not on this side, or the one that's on this side that's not on this side. It should use that setting that doesn't exist on the other side. So we're good to leave our weather controller's forecast here, and it's going to use this one since there's no specific key for the weather forecast controller over here on this side. Just like the same with this property here called allowed host. This is, I believe, used for some of the cross-site scripting, prevention stuff. And it doesn't exist on the development side, but it does on the production side. So keep that in mind as well. That's everything with the app settings that you need to know for now. Other than that, again, this can be used for anything. There's classes that you can inject into yours to read the configurations, or you can build it and save it and use it later. But you can put any keys in here. This doesn't have to be specific stuff. You can make these up and read them however you want to. I think we'll go into that section here shortly, although we won't be doing anything with the manual configuration loading yet, so I guess you wouldn't see that yet. The next file that we had generated with this project was the program.cs. We touched on this. This is all the code that's going to be called when your website starts up. I don't like to add too much code in here. You definitely will have to add some code in here depending on if you want to add some authentication, all sorts of things. If you want to use the cores for the cross-site scripting stuff, there's a whole mess of extension methods for this application and for the builder that can be used to set up different logging. The main thing that we're going to use it for in this series is this section up here where it says add services to the container, and I guess we'll add some services down here as well. So one of the things that we would do we want to... I'm not going to touch on it yet. Let's just keep going. Just again, know that this is what's actually starting your website. And here is that setting I was talking about where it's saying if the app.environment is development. Now you won't see other ones for is production and is staging. And you also have is environment where you can set it yourself. But is development, these are just some predefined ones. You can use any environment names. It's just better to go with the convention that everybody's been using for decades. Development, production, and staging. So I've made testing ones. I've made build server ones. I've done all sorts of different ones, but just leave the is development alone since we have in our launch.json we have our environment set to development. That means that in this scenario the specific code is to turn on the use HSTS. I don't know exactly what that is, if I'm being completely honest. I know it has something to do with I believe the certificates and the handshake process and how long those are cached or kept valid, something along those lines. Use HTTPS redirection. What this is doing is it's setting up your site since if we go into our properties and we go into our launch settings, here you can see that the application URL key, it actually has the values with two different websites in it. So you have the HTTP one and you have the HTTPS one. And since we have HTTP set up and being listened on, what this is doing is it's saying, hey, if they connect to us via the HTTP, then redirect them to the HTTPS one. So we're setting it up in our project here. If you were using IIS, you could set it up, inside of the actual web server itself. But this is something that is really nice. Use static files, use routing. These are all things that we don't need to talk about them at the moment. Just know that you probably ought to keep them and not play with them. the map controller route, this is the pattern that it's looking for, the controller, the action, if it doesn't have an action, the index, and what this is it's the URL. So depending on the URL of the website and what it's listening for, it's going to default to going here. And if we were to go to that weather forecast controller, you can see that ours is, again, with the route it's called controller. So if somebody comes to /weather forecast, this is the controller that it's going to hit. And that was told, I believe, here. So let's go ahead and save that and fall back to file index.html. In this case, the index.html, I believe what's happening here is that it's falling back to, where's she at? I thought it was under client source. Yeah, so it is under source here, and you'll see this index.html. I don't want to touch on too much of the client stuff yet, but just know that this is the actual loading screen for your Angular website. And this app root loading here, this app root's what's going to start loading the actual Angular stuff up. And it's just going to show loading until it's got its components and everything ready. So if you wanted to make a fancy loading image or use some sort of a picture or something else, the title of your website, the loading message, and maybe any specific meta or maybe keywords, anything like that, you would put all of those here because this is the index.html page that we've told it to fall back to. Meaning, if we were to go basically, if there is no action at all defined, there's no URL at all put in, it's just the /, the root of our website. I believe it's hitting this. And the final line is just a run, which is telling all this, it's actually executing things that they had set. That is pretty much it. We can go ahead and delve into the this website.cs proj a little bit, and that might kind of tie the rest of the pipeline in for you. So the SPA root, what this is doing, again, these are settings that are being looked at and read by this Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.SPA proxy. And that's where we had talked about the startup assemblies in our environment variables. So it's reading some of these SPA settings up here. So just, again, SPA root. Maybe you really hated the name client app. This is where it's telling it that the name client app maps to this folder here, client app, and that this is where it's going to start looking and really start running its npm commands from. The SPA proxy URL, I've mentioned back and forth now that there's two different web servers that are running at the same time, the live development one and the actual .NET one. This is telling the .NET one, or really the SPA code, that once it's finished loading, or once it's finished this launch command, this is the URL it's going to redirect to once it detected that the proxy was started. And just to go to the next command, the SPA proxy launch command, this is running the npm start command. And what that means is if we go to our client app folder and we go to the package.json, there's some script section up here, and there's a script called start, which is then just running a script called run script os. And we'll go back here. And this is that script that's really starting to detect what's the operating system we have. Do I have my development server, certificates installed? And it's going to then call start Windows, which is going to actually start the Angular development server up. We were in the website.project one. I don't think there's anything else to really discuss in here at the moment. This is the one package reference that we have coming in, so that's the external code that we've imported from NuGet. The build, this is going to go ahead and detect if we need to, do we have Node installed on our computer? I guess that's a dependency I didn't mention in the first video, but it will tell you that you don't have Node installed and to install Node. Anything else we need to talk about? Nothing else really important to discuss right now. So we'll close out of there. And now let's get a little bit more into the client-side code. That's pretty much it for the .NET side of things. Now for the client-side code, I guess the main place to start again is to go back to the package.json, because these are the scripts that are getting called when we start up our projects, and these are scripts that you can use later on. All of the, let's see, none of these scripts really you'll run manually in the development pipeline that we have set up now, except for maybe the test and the ng commands. And we'll do a lot of ng commands as we make this website. And if you're smart and you do your unit testing on your client-side stuff too, which I'll admit that I haven't delved into myself yet, and there's just too many projects, too many things, but I would say for your own sanity, because I've been on the bad side of this. I've had a lot of struggles where if I just had my unit testing set up and I was actually writing my unit test on the client side code too, I'd have been a lot happier. So you'll want to run this test command manually, and you'll want to run these commands, and those can both be done anytime you're in the client app folder. Just again, I'm in the client app folder here. Anytime you're in here, if you were to do something like npm run script and then the name of the script that you want to run, so let's just say we want to run the unit tests that are set up. And just to show you real quick before I actually run it, let's find one of these components that actually, so the counter has a unit test set up, and all the unit tests, at least in the default configuration that we have, are component.spec.test. And if you look, it has some sort of a fixture defined with some sort of test that it's going to assert on them. So since we have unit test, if we were to run npm run script test, we'll let that run. And you can see what it actually, the command that it actually ran in the end was ng test. You might ask why you want to write ng, test versus ng test. Well, if you end up with scripts, or this test script in particular, and you want to pass a lot of arguments into it, let's just open up our package.json again, where I can show you. Oh, and before we finish that, you could just see that the test actually ran. It started Chrome, it ran the test, and it showed me some test results. I didn't actually catch if it showed them to you on my stream here, but you can see that 2 tests were ran and both of them were a success. So if you are writing these client-side tests, just know that that's the command that you'll use to actually run those. Going back to the package.json, like I said, watch, you won't really run that. Build, you won't run that. Start, you won't run that manually. And the ng ones, we'll definitely dive a lot more into those. But back to my point about why would you want to run test instead of just ng test? Because if I go to my command prompt, let me end these tests here, get to a new window. Again, I'm in the client app folder. And if I was to just run ng test, well, that's working just fine as well. So test versus ng test, you're not really saving any time there. But up here you can see where that really starts to make sense is where you have commands and scripts that are passing in a lot of parameters. you don't want to have to remember or be copying and pasting these parameters every time you want to run the script. So you would have a ng test with some sort of parameters that you've defined for your testing. Maybe you're passing in some variables or something like that. It's just a good practice to just go ahead and start setting them up here and using them now. That way you don't get used to it one way. All of a sudden you find out you have a bunch of parameters you need to pass in, and it's just a big adjustment, or you forget to pass in the parameters all the time. So while I have it up, I'll go ahead and show you, just in case it didn't last time. I'll go ahead and show you. It was launched on my other screen already, but since this is the screen that's being streamed here on YouTube, you can see that the tests here, you can see that the counter component had two assertions, should start with a count of 0 and then increment by 1 when clicked, and that's what the test checked, and then should display a title, and again that's what the test checked. And those test fixtures we showed you were the .spec.ts files. So let me go ahead and close this terminal. End that test. I just did Control-C to end that test. And I think that's it for the package.json. Now, the next thing, again, if we go to the index.html, the first thing that it's got here is the app root. And that's being used to tell what it's really doing is it's calling this, it's putting this app component inside of it. So you've got the selector here, app root. I don't think that necessarily ties, or I don't think it's actually used to tie them together, but there is some code inside. I believe it's hidden by all the Webpack processes and stuff now, where this app root is going to call this app module code here and start the process. So the app module, all of the components and pages and everything are inside of modules. So the app module is the main module of our whole Angular website. And it's got a couple of components that are part of it. And if you look, it's got a nav menu, it's got the app component itself. It's got the home, the counter, and the fetch data component, and these components were the pages that we had. So you've got the home component, and if we just scroll down a little bit, you'll see inside of this imports there's this routing setup, and inside of it there's a path that's just blank, meaning if there's no path that's been specifically typed in, it's going to default to this component, which is our home component. And if we were to go to the folder home, and we open the home component.ts, this is the component. There's nothing to it right now, but this is the component and the HTML that's going to show for that home page, or the blank route that was defined there. So back in here, if it's your website /counter, then it's going to use the counter component, and same with the fetch data. That was the sample that was calling the API. So getting around in these files, you saw me browsing over here and going to it, but especially if you just want to access the TypeScript section of things, you can go to the definition. So I hold Control and I click on it, but you can click on it and then hit F12 as well, depending on your hotkey setup. So I'll hold Control and I'll click on it, and you can see it took me right into the class for the component for the fetch data. Going back over here, just to show you it works again, if you hold Control and click, then it took me right to the code here for the home component TS. Nothing else to this right now. The providers section is going to be pretty important later when we start passing in configurations and stuff. But just know that the app component, which was the first one here in the initial main component of our website that was being tied by that app root, if we go take a look at that real quick at the HTML for it, you can see that there's this nav menu, and then it's got a div with the class of container with this router outlet in it. And so anytime you see router outlet inside of one of the HTML files, that is the place that it's going to get replaced with the component that was defined for the necessary route. So by route, I mean this configuration section we just talked about where the counter, if somebody types in /counter at our website, it's going to go to the counter component. So anything inside of the counter component's HTML, if we go to that, this is going to be what shows up inside of that router outlet section. So because we came to the counter from the router that was inside of the app module, that's the router outlet that's going to be supplied. So back in here, and that's pretty much it. So in this basic website that's set up, this is the main template of the website. So everything in here is going to show up for every single page that we go to. So if you notice, there was no code for the navigation section inside of the home component or inside of the counter component. That's in here, and those components are just being shown here. So it's like our website is, those components are here, and this is the main template. Okay, back to the app module. I don't think there's anything else important to bring up in here at the moment. Just know that if you use a component inside of this module, and we're going to make many modules, and we'll reference those, and we'll pull the routing out of here, and we'll fine tune this so this isn't full of things that are important that we're going to change a lot. Just if you make a new page, I guess we can. I don't want to make a new page yet. Just we'll get there probably in the next video. But these are all the pages that are listed. These are the routes for the pages. The names of the websites don't have to match, the component name. If our component name is home, you can see that the path is blank. Like I said, the counter could be called counters. The path is just the / on the website URL, and the component is the code that's going to be displayed inside of our layout. And that's it for this section. If we go down to assets, there's nothing in there that's important at the moment. Environments, this is a similar but not exactly the same. This is similar to what we were doing with the environment variables inside of our .NET side of things when we were in our app settings.json files. This is the same similar concept. If our environment is production, it's going to use this file here, and it's at the moment it's just got a property inside of it called production set to true. But if we look at the environment.ts that's not environment.prod.ts, you can see here it's the same, but it's set to false. So you can set different properties depending on if it's the test environment or the production environment. And where that's set, where those environment variables are set, in this case is 1 when the startup script runs. So if we were to go inside of the package.json again, there's parameters that you can pass into ngserve to say whether this is a production environment or not. Those aren't being set here. So what is it going to do? It's going to fall back to the Angular ones. So this is a good time to go look at the angular.json file. Now, again, there's a lot of stuff in here. Don't be too intimidated by it. You probably won't be changing things in here anytime soon. But again, if you look at our configuration section up here, you can see we've got a section defined for production, and we've got a section defined for development. So the development one is the default one that's being passed in unless a production flag is being put over here, I believe, inside of our package.json startup script. And there's different, the budgets listed here, just for example. These are warnings that are going to go off when we build for our production environment to actually release this website for other people to use. If we have our main load file, our JSON or JavaScript file that's being loaded. If that's bigger than 500 kilobytes, throw a warning. If it's bigger than 1 meg, throw an error. So these will help you figure out if you've got components that are getting out of hand, and maybe the load times for your users is just going to be way too long because you're asking them to do an initial load of JavaScript and HTML files, etc., that are more than a meg in this scenario. Same with the any component style. This is saying, I believe, for just the style, I guess. So for just the CSS or SCSS part of it, if you've got a big old style sheet in there, go ahead and warn if it's 2K or throw an error if it's 4 kilobytes. But if we look down here in our development section, those aren't being shown. So we're not getting warnings or errors for those component sizes inside of development. If you wanted to add those warnings, you could just copy that section, put it down here in development, and then you'll know before you try to put this into your build pipeline or however you end up releasing this to production, that you don't have to wait all the way until then to realize that things are getting out of control. Now, for development, we've got just some properties: build optimizer false, optimization false. These are things that might mess with our debugging process. Vendor chunk true. That's going to put all of our third-party libraries in one JavaScript file instead of trying to have a bunch of different JavaScript files get loaded when they first visit the website and it's trying to load. This is going to make it just one file, and that way you have to wait on less HTTP connections to resolve. Extract licenses false. What that will do is it will generate a licenses file. In this case, we have it turned off for development, but I don't see it listed for production, so it probably defaults to true. And what that's going to give you is a licenses file, probably license.txt or something along those lines. And it's going to try to find and extract all of the license files that are in the other packages that we bring in. So all of these packages in the packages.json, let's say that there's a license that's inside of this bootstrap library. What it's going to do is it's going to find that license and it's going to go ahead and include it. So that way, if you need to be providing credits or something along those lines, it's going to try to help you make sure that you're doing the right thing in regards to giving, the credits to people, or, a lot of them probably don't really matter, but it just, maybe you shouldn't even be using one of these, and you forgot, and maybe you used it for just testing real quick, but you can't use this library if you're doing something for your company, maybe. Now, I just made that up for popper.js. You definitely can use it, and all of these you should be able to, or they wouldn't be part of the sample for the most part. So just keep that in mind as we get further into this and we start adding different, third-party libraries to our Angular website. Maybe we want to add some, I don't know, a date time picker, and somebody made one, but they put a license on it. When we add that date time picker, that license is going to show up in our extracted licenses in the end, which is a good thing. The source map, again, this is going to help the debugger find the map between the, I don't want to call it compiled, we'll call it compiled for now, the transcribed JavaScript and the actual TypeScript that we wrote. Because when we're writing inside of our, let's just go back to the counter.component.ts, this code here is not what's actually going to end up in the JavaScript files that the client loads. This, section of code is never going to actually look like this inside of the JavaScript files. So there's a transpiler that's taking place during the build process, and it's converting this code into actual JavaScript code that can be read by a browser, because a browser has no idea what this stuff is. So just keep in mind, again, that process is in place and that there's some transpiling happening. And going back to our Angular.json. I think that's all we need to kind of go over in here for now. This is the serve configuration. So when somebody types ng serve, you can see here, and I got this wrong before. So here is where we're saying that the default configuration to use if they don't pass in a different flag is to set it as development. So that's where that ties in. The extract I18N, that's for different languages if you're going to follow the I18N spec, which is Angular is going to try to use by default. Here we've got that command that was being used by the ng test. Now again, because all commands that start with ng are Angular related, that's why ng test is defined in here. So you can see it's using the karma testing setup. I'm not going to go over it too much. It's just a default configuration. It works, and you should be good to go. Nothing else too important in here. The source root, this is saying that when Angular starts looking to do its compilation and everything else, that it can find our code inside of the src folder. So if for some reason, again, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you were to change these, you would want to update that source root to be the same. The prefix here is pretty important. This is going to actually be used by every single component that you make as a default selector for it, and I'll explain what that means later. So just know that the prefix here for every single component, we'll go ahead and just go briefly into what the selector is. You can see when it generated this TypeScript file, it named the selector app.counter or -counter -component. So that app, you can see, is being prefixed for every single one of the components that we make. And these components, you wouldn't, this is a bad sample because I'm doing this component in itself. But what that means is if we were to start an opening bracket and we type app dash, you can see that all of our components are listed here. So earlier I told you that they come out of the router outlet inside of the layout, but these pages can reference other pages and can reference other pages. There could be, a wide variety of nesting going on. So maybe if we wanted the home page, all that content that shows up on the home page, to also show up under our counter, all we would do was we would add that app-home here, and if we bring up the app component.ts, you can see, I'm sorry, I said the home page, didn't I? Not the app. So we'll go to the home.component.ts, and you can see the selector is app-home, and that's how we referenced it inside of our counter.html. So again, that's what the selectors are. And the point of this was to show you that the prefix that every single one of them gets generated with is defined inside of that angular.json file. So that's what the prefix is. I would guess as you have a need to actually figure out these things, you'll come in here. It's a very important file for everything with the building and the output that you get with the building. Whether things are minimized, whether they're not, all of those things are going to be defined here. The last section I will mention real quick because they're super important too, is the styles section and the script section. For the most part, and I would say 99.5% of the time these days, you don't need to come in here adding scripts manually. If you're adding packages that are written in up-to-date standards, different, ES6 and, better stuff, you don't need to worry about all this scripts. But the styles are important, and you can see, because this default Angular starter website that we generated uses Bootstrap as its UI, and when we went to our main index.html, you don't see any sort of reference to bring in any sort of CSS or script files, and that's because it's doing it as part of this. So that Bootstrap CSS, all the styling for the Bootstrap is defined here, and the source /styles.css. That's actually being defined here. So it's pointing to our own project styles here. Now, one of the things, I guess we'll just go ahead and do it now. This is the testing, so just make sure that if you have styling, you wouldn't really need to apply styling, from too many other things, but depending on how in-depth your tests are, you might need to bring in the styles as well. So it's just imported ours as by default, but you can see it left out the bootstrap one because when the unit testing is going on, it doesn't really care that it's displaying the grid system perfectly or anything like that. Again, that's going to depend on how in-depth your tests are. Anything else in here? Roots left blank. One of the things that I want to do for this project is to change the default styles from CSS to use Sass or SCSS. So what we can do there, and it's supported out of the box by Angular, but I'm just going to grab the configuration for CSS or SCSS. And if we come and look for the default section here, we have our schematics here. What we can do is we can add a schematic, and what we want to affect is, I guess, the component. What we can do is we should be able to set a style, and we will set it to SCSS. That's perfect. I'm going to go ahead and rename that to SCSS, which is the default style file that we had. And I'm going to do the same thing to the actual file itself. And I'm going to use SCSS. And what this is going to let us do is the SCSS over CSS has a lot of benefits, like using variables. Now today, in a CSS file, anytime we wanted to reuse the color, we'd have to come in do a find and replace or something like that. But using the Sass, what we can do is we can just say, we'll just say color-blue, and we'll set its property to that 0366D6, which is that blue color. And now anytime we wanted to be reusing that same blue color, we can go ahead and reference the variable instead of that hard-coded value. And we'll do a lot of replacing this in some future videos as we finally actually start to work on the website. So again, we went ahead and renamed it to SCSS. For the sake of the test, I believe we need to do the same. So I'll just look for .css real quick, and I'll go ahead and do a replace on that. Perfect. Now, we didn't actually tell Angular anything about what's the default one to use. It's just going to know, hey, he pointed me to an SCSS file. There's some sort of, again, transpiling that needs to happen to convert that SCSS into actual CSS, because in the client browser, those variables aren't used when we had this open. What's actually happening during the build process is it's replacing this color blue with the value. So in the end, it will look like that original CSS that we had there. It's just for our own sanity, as we want to come into this project and do things, we want to be using the variables and not doing large find and replace over many, SCSS files, etc. And it will also let us create a file for stylings. Maybe we'll call it colors.css, and we'll define a bunch of colors in there. And we can actually import, and I guess we'll just do it for a sample real quick. Let's create a folder inside of this app folder. And let me just make sure I'm not telling you a fib there. So we're actually going to create it inside of the source folder. Just go ahead and do new folder. and we'll call it styles. And inside of that styles folder, let's just create a new file, and we'll call it colors.scss. And I'm going to grab that variable name that we had put on the other one. I'm just going to paste it over here. So now we have a colors.css with the color blue in it. And we don't want to go into our angular.json and just keep adding our own styles in here. That's, it's going to get messy. We'll forget things. What we want to do is just come over here into the styles.css, and we'll do an import, and we're going to import styles.colors.scss. So if we were to do that, you can now see that we're not getting any sort of complaints about the color blue. It knows that it exists from the import. If I remove it, when we build, I guess I'll build. I was expecting it to tell us with some underlining that it wasn't valid, but we're not getting that at the moment. So I'll build the project. I'll take you to the website. And if we look in our terminal window down here, again, this is doing all the Angular build process. It should give us an error message about that styling. Now this is a big long error message, but if we just scroll up, we'll see the key information here that we're looking for at the very top of it, and it's just going to say that the color blue is an undefined variable. So again, because we have hot reload turned on, now sometimes hot reload won't work properly if you got an error on that initial build and it's not hot reloading. But let's see if we did, and we do actually have it working. So we'll go back over here, and after I had saved that fix, you can see that it tried to do the recompile again, and it did it successfully this time, now that our import is okay. So if we had written any other SCSS files, if we want to reference those colors inside of maybe one of our pages specifically, maybe the home page, or let's actually go to the nav menu. You can see there's a CSS file here for the nav menu. That's because it was created before we made that change. So even though all of our new components will get created with this SCSS already, this one, it will still work perfectly fine with the CSS, but we're going to actually rename it to SCSS, which will give us access to that functionality, like doing imports and a lot of mix-ins and all sorts of different things that you're going to learn along the way. But what we can do now is, again, we'll do import, and we're going to import the styles. Now in this scenario, I don't know that it likes that relative path. I'm just going to assume that it should, and we'll do colors.scss. And if we come over here, it did seem to link it up now. Maybe what we want to do is we'll change the whole navbar brand section, and we'll change the back color of it, and we're going to use our new color blue. And if we save that, we're not actually going to be in a working state yet. Let me take you over to the terminal window so you can see that we had gotten an error here. And the reason we got an error is because we renamed this file, but in our TypeScript for that component, you can see here that we told it that the file name for the styles for this were just .css. So it's looking for this file and it doesn't find it anymore because we renamed it. So all we need to do is just update our style URLs. And just since we're looking at this and we're talking about it, obviously this one component can reference multiple styles itself. It's just, if you're doing things the right way, 99.9% of the time, you shouldn't be referencing multiple styles in here. The template URL, just since we're talking about it again, that's telling it to look for that .html file that's with it in the folder. So it's telling it to look here. So this TypeScript file is the most important one that's getting loaded up, and it's telling it, here's the HTML for me, here's the CSS or SCSS for me, and then those will get loaded up and used by Angular. So we should be, if I flip back over and we've saved everything, and we've saved that now, you can see it's actually saying that it can't find the styles colors that CSS now. So it doesn't like this it doesn't seem to want to use this. So we'll put a slash there. No, I don't know where. I think the root of it is just blank. So we would need to do source, styles, colors. And then if we look over here, so this was just me. I didn't type in the correct path for it because this folder for the component is further in. Oh, it actually came up with error on this one this time. I'm not exactly sure why that happened there, but just know, again, I guess that's a good example that the paths that you pick, it's going to take a little bit to get used to which ones are, what's the path, the relative paths, and everything else. So here we've started with slash, which is going to start us at the root of all this client-side stuff. And then we went with source, styles, colors, and I'll explain further where that's defined inside of these TypeScript configs later. And then here in the nav menu, you can see that it seems to have worked just off the styles / colors for some reason. So that's because the Angular app knows that we've told it that the start is app, or source, sorry. So that's perfectly fine. I don't know why it had a problem with this one, but we fixed it and we're going to move on. And the whole point of that was to change the color of the nav bar, which it didn't seem to do here. Let me just refresh, make sure I'm not lying to you. And so why didn't it actually import those colors? First, let me just make sure that the path actually worked out okay. Now the background color nav bar, I didn't actually try to test this. Let me just put it as important for the time being. And now you can see that it's there. Let me make sure that that important wasn't. So there must be another style that's applied to this nav brand. And if we were to look maybe in our source for the styles, which is the styles.scss, I don't see why it needed the important there, but it did seem to want the important there. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it didn't need the important there. It's still showing up without it. Just got a little confused there. So I think we're in good shape. Let's go ahead and remove that. And there's no reason to leave imports to things that you're not actually using code from. That's just extra work that has to be done by the build. And let's continue down to look at more of the files that were included. So we've talked about the app module. The app.server one, I believe that's just if you're going to do the Angular universal stuff. I haven't delved into that myself, so I don't even think we need this file. The main.ts, this is the startup code. Oh, okay, so here's where you can see that it was bootstrapping the app module. So this is where it's actually telling it that the app module is the module that needs to start being looked at in order to go find everything else that it's calling and that it's been tied to. All the other modules that we make are going to be imported into this app module. And all the components that we make will be in those modules or in this module itself. All the third-party stuff that we bring in, we're going to bring all those into this app module. So this is the main one, and you can just see it's just going to go ahead and catch any errors and put them out to the console. If the environment is production, enable production mode. That's talking about those environment variables and different things that are set up to happen for production. And the base URL, this is just getting the base URL, it's just getting a tag name base and grabbing the href property from that. So these providers, again, anytime you see these providers, these are pretty much passing settings in that somebody's going to grab based off this key here. Some component further down the line is going to want to know what's the base URL, and it's set up to go ahead and provide that right away. Polyfills, this is where we're defining which browsers we're supporting. Maybe we want to specify that we want to use IE11. Well, in order for IE11 to work, because it doesn't have some of the functionality that the newer browsers have, we could uncomment this line, and we could import this classlist.js in addition to running the npm install command to go ahead and import that third-party package and fix that error that we would get if our users were using Internet Explorer 11. So the same thing can be said for all the browsers. Zone.js is used by the Angular CLI. We're not going to touch that. But here you can see that there's some different flags, and really read through this to see, do you want to enable certain things. Here's one. So we got the web animations that we could include from the Angular platform browser animations. It's only required if the animation builder is used in the application and for IE and Edge or Safari. So I don't plan on using any animations for the most part, but you might want to, and if you want to support Internet Explorer / Edge or Safari, you're going to go ahead and need to import this web animations-js and go ahead and install the appropriate third-party library that it's saying here. And you can do that for any of the other libraries that hey, if the internet, maybe you want to support Chrome that's 2 versions back, or you want to do something specific because of the different browsers people are using. This is where it's expecting you to take care of all of the different things and define which browsers you're supporting or what needs to happen for you to support them. Styles, we already talked about that. The test, this is just, again, it's used by the unit test for Angular and the default Karma setup. We're not going to go too deep into that. Browser lists. You can tell the build system, it has its own configurations and settings that it knows that it needs to do to support different versions. So by the default configuration that we have here, it's just trying to keep up. So it's just saying, hey, do build settings that are at least supported in the last one version of Chrome, at least as far as the Chrome version that Angular knew about at the time that they wrote the code, etc. Same thing with Firefox, the last 2 Edge major versions. So maybe this is something you want to play with. Maybe you only want to support cutting edge browsers, or maybe you want to do different things with some of the older browsers. Make sure you're opting into all that here. Editor config, that's not specifically related to Angular. The git ignore, we're not actually using that because our git is all the way up here in the solution, so that can probably be deleted as well. Angular.json, we touched on that. The ASP.NET Core HTTPS, so this is the script that starts up before the terminal window when we start debugging. And this is going to try to detect if you have the certificates in the .NET Core or the .NET development certificates in place. And it should, as long as everything works out well, it will go ahead and run the commands to give you a working certificate. So your SSL or HTTPS, will load up okay. And they don't have an error in the top left of their screen that says invalid certificate, or I think Chrome might even give you a big warning message and ask you, are you sure you want to continue? If you're getting that, make sure you look into this and see maybe you need to generate those .NET certs yourself. Nothing else to really talk about in here. This is just kind of making sure that the certificates are in place. Now, what called this? Because this needs to be called long before Angular boots up, right? So if we go back to our package.json, you can see that there's a script here called pre-start, and it's telling Node to run this script. So ASP.NET Core-HTTPS, and that matches up with that file name ASP.NET Core HTTPS. It just has the extension left off. But that's what's going to tell this. This is one of the first things that's actually going to start happening when we hit F5 and start debugging. The karma config, that's the unit testing. We won't go into that, pretty much at all. But this is just some basic settings you might need to look at if you're going to be doing a lot of that. The proxy.config.json. Now, this is important because this is what's actually telling Angular, hey, if you get a request for this URL, like /website, then what I want you to do is redirect to the ASP.NET Core website that's running. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to rename this, because the way that this sample template has it set up is you'd have to come in here over and over every time you add different APIs. And that's not what we're going to want to do at all. So what we want to do is say, anytime we try to get to a page, or our Angular app calls an API or something like that, anytime the URL starts with /API, you should proxy that request to the .NET side of things. So we'll leave that as /API, but what that means is now that our .NET side of things it wouldn't find this API anymore, because this API doesn't know anything about being behind a /API URL. So we want to add API here on our controllers. So anytime we add a new API on the .NET side of things, we'll make sure that this is the route that set the API /controller name. And what that will do, it'll leave us kind of with a set it and forget it thing. Just as long as we set this up with our controllers, we don't need to go into our proxy anymore. Very limited occasions we'll come back in here. But just know that because we set this as /API, now all the URLs that have /API in them are going to get redirected to the .NET side of things. And that's pretty much all that file is doing. You can see here, it's also looking for some environment variables. It should, and this is where it's actually pulling it out. When we went into our launch settings, find those in the properties real quick, you can see that it set this application URL with these. So when it launches, it's pulling out, it's parsing this, it's saying, hey, this is a HTTPS, here's the port, and it's setting that environment variable itself. If you wanted to, maybe you want to use a different one, or you want that proxy to know about a different one, you would just simply come in here, you would type in that key, and you would set your own port in there, and that would tell the proxy to start using this port. So we'll back that out because we don't need to make that change. And so again, it's going to try to find that port. If it can't find it, it's going to do some fallbacks, and just, if it found that port, it's going to do this. If it didn't find it, it's going to look for the environment variable ASP.NET Core URLs. So because that one does exist over, we got too many windows open now, but I'll just say in the launch settings. Because the application URL did exist, it should be looking at this one. And when we go back into our proxy config, you can see that it's splitting that string, it's grabbing the first URL, and if it can't find the first URL, it's just got a hard-coded path in here to look at this website and this port and go with that. So that's all there is to it. I wouldn't recommend you modify these, this script up here at all and hard code your own stuff. You want to use the environment variables and you want to do things that you're not going into a bunch of files every time you want to change the port or different things like that. So make sure you use the configurations where they're available and don't mess with those too much. Let's just go ahead and close everything here. It's getting kind of unruly. Going further down the list, we were at the proxy. Obviously you have a README file. This is not very important in here, but having a README out here, especially if you're using GitHub or something like that, in your main solution folder, that the main part where your git init happen, that's important to, it's important to have a good README. So now we're going into the Tsconfig section. This is the last parts of all the client-side files we're going to talk about. So we have the tsconfig.app.json. These are pretty much the tsconfig.app is extending the tsconfig.json. It's just, I think technically, you could stuff all this stuff into one file. It's just trying to keep a little separation on things and keep it a little bit cleaner. So is there anything we need to kind of talk about in here? I'd say at the moment, no. Again, you can just see that this is how it knows to look at that main.ts and the polyfills really before Angular gets going, and so our TypeScript itself knows to come look for things. And it's going to include all the TypeScript definition files that are inside of the source folder. We'll get more into that later. Here we've got the tsconfig.json. This is the main one where everything's at. So we've got a base URL. We don't really need to touch that. You can see that there's output directories where it's going to generate the TypeScript stuff, declaration files that we just had talked about. And these are just different settings for what TypeScript is going to detect when it's running. So, and when I say TypeScript is going to detect, maybe we're in one of these TypeScript files like this one here, and we write some code in here that may be perfectly valid, a = 1, but you can see here that it's obviously this isn't valid, but these kinds of IntelliSense things may differ depending on the settings that you select in here. So depending on the different versions of JavaScript that or ECMAScript, JavaScript that you're gonna support and write your code in, or what you want them transpiled down to, these are all gonna come into play on how all of that's working. I won't go into every single one of them. If you want to know more about each one of them, you should just be able to hover over them. It'll give you a link that you can click on with more information. And this file will get changed, so keep that in mind. If you do different Angular upgrades, as they add different flags into these compiler options and the TypeScript versions change and things like that, there'll be new properties and stuff that they want to support. So just know that these files can change, and I don't know, what it would do with overwriting them. I think it would probably, leave your preferences in place for the additional stuff, but just keep that in mind as this file can be modified, and this one probably is meant to be there and not be modified by different scripts and stuff like that. So maybe this is probably where you would want to put your settings that you pick that you don't want changed by upgrades and other automatic kind of code. Angular compiler options, you can see this is some specific stuff. Enable the IN or I18N legacy message ID. Strict injection parameters, this would tell you, just because you have an injection key, you still need to have the right types and everything associated. You can't just be using any as your type all over the place. And the ts.spec.json, this is the one that's set up for the karma testing, so the unit testing again. And that is really every file, or at least one of each version of a file that we got with the whole creation of this project. If you have any questions specifically about these files, make sure you just leave a comment and I'll try to get back to you or clarify exactly what it's doing. But I think we covered everything. And I hope to see you back for video 3. Thanks.